recalibrating, as if something didn't quite match the expectation he'd already built. "Tell me," he said, not looking at the menu, not looking at the room, only at her. "What would you recommend to someone who doesn't like to waste time?" And it wasn't really a question, not the way he said it. It was a setup, a narrowing of space, a way of forcing an answer into a frame he controlled. And Clara paused just long enough to acknowledge it, not long enough to challenge it, then nodded once. "The ribeye is our most consistent choice," she replied. Simple, direct, no extra words to grab onto. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression, not disappointment, not yet, but adjustment, like a chess player realizing the first move didn't land the way he expected, and he leaned back again, slower this time, his fingers steepled lightly. "Consistent," he repeated, almost tasting the word. "That's safe." And there it was, the shift, the gentle push, the invitation to defend, to justify, to explain, to reveal something more than necessary. But Clara didn't move, didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't correct him. She simply waited, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her presence quiet but unshaken. And in that stillness, something subtle began to tilt. Not in the room, not in the noise or the lighting or the rhythm of service, but between them, in that invisible space where control either holds or slips. And Ethan felt it before he understood it. The smallest resistance, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable, like pressing against something that didn't push back yet refused to move. And for the first time that evening, his timing was just slightly off. The pause stretched just a second too long, and Ethan noticed it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, like she had measured exactly how much silence to give and no more. And that was unusual, because most people either rushed to fill space or froze inside it. But she did neither. She simply stood there, steady, waiting, and it forced him to move first, which he did not like, not even a little. So he shifted forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more personal, more direct. "Tell me something," he said, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Do you always give safe answers, or do you ever take risks?" And there it was again, another frame, another invitation to step into a role he had already imagined for her. Something predictable, something easy to define. And Clara picked up the pen from her notepad, her fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged, and she met his gaze for the briefest moment before writing something down, not answering, not reacting, just continuing her work as if his question had been a detail, not a demand. And for a split second, Ethan felt that same subtle resistance again, that quiet refusal to engage on his terms, and it irritated him more than any argument could have, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dismantle, just absence, and absence did not behave the way he expected. "I asked you a question," he said, not louder, but sharper, the edge now unmistakable, and a few nearby conversations dipped in volume without anyone turning their heads, the room sensing tension without needing to see it. And Clara finished writing, tore the page cleanly, and set it on the table with the same careful precision she had used for the glass of water, her voice calm, almost neutral. "Your order will be ready in about 12 minutes, she said. And for a moment, the simplicity of it landed harder than any clever reply, because it did not acknowledge the challenge. It did not validate the premise. It simply moved forward, and Ethan leaned back again, slower this time, studying her in a different way now, less certain, more deliberate, like he was trying to locate the point where control had shifted without his permission. "You did not answer," he said, and Clara gave the smallest nod, not defensive, not dismissive, just factual. "I heard you," she replied, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just acknowledgement without submission. And something in that balance unsettled him, because it removed the leverage he was used to, the moment where people either complied or resisted, where he could categorize them and adjust accordingly. But she fit into neither space. She simply existed outside the pattern, and patterns were how he won, always had been. And he felt a flicker of something he rarely allowed himself to feel in situations like this. Not confusion exactly, but disruption, a break in rhythm. And he did not like broken rhythms, so he changed tactics, his voice smoothing out, the edge replaced with something almost conversational. almost reasonable. "What is your name?" he asked, as if the previous tension had not existed, as if this was a reset, a new entry point. And Clara glanced at her name tag for half a second, not because she needed to, but because it gave him the answer without giving him anything else. "Clara," she said, and he nodded slowly, repeating it under his breath like he was testing how it fit. "Clara." And then he smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with intent, the kind of smile that signaled a move rather than a feeling. "All right, Clara," he said, tapping the edge of the table once with his finger. "Let us try something different." And across from him, she stood exactly the same, unchanged, as if whatever he was about to do next had already been accounted for. And that realization, quiet and unspoken, settled into the space between them like something heavier than words. The smile lingered just long enough to suggest confidence, but not long enough to hide the calculation behind it. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice again as if inviting her into something private, something exclusive. "Let us make this interesting," he said, his tone smooth now, almost generous. "I will ask you 3 questions, simple ones, and if you answer them honestly, I will leave you a tip that is worth your entire shift." And the words hung there, carefully chosen. Not just an offer, but a pressure point, a way of reframing the interaction into something transactional, something he understood, something he could control. And around them, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continued, but there was a subtle shift in attention, a few glances that lingered a second too long, a pause in conversation that suggested people were listening without looking, and Clara did not move, not even slightly, her expression unchanged, her hands resting lightly against the edge of her notepad, as if the offer had not altered the space at all, and that stillness forced him to continue. "First question," he said, tapping the table once. "Why do people like you pretend not to care when you clearly do?" And it was not really about her, not entirely. It was a generalization dressed as curiosity, a way of pulling her into a category he had already defined. And Clara listened, her eyes steady, her breathing even. And when he finished, she gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the words without accepting the premise. And then she said nothing, not a deflection, not a refusal, just silence. And the absence of response landed heavier this time, because it followed an explicit invitation, a clearly defined game. And she had simply declined to step onto the board, and Ethan's fingers stilled against the table, the rhythm he had maintained breaking for just a second before he adjusted, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Second question," he continued, the smoothness returning but thinner now, stretched over something less certain. "What would it take for you to stop playing it safe?" And again, the same structure, the same attempt to frame her, to define her before she could define herself. And again, Clara did not answer, her gaze calm, her posture unchanged, as if the question had passed through her without leaving a mark. And this time, the silence felt different, not passive, not empty, but deliberate, like a choice made long before this moment. And Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly through his nose, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he studied her, really studied her now, not as a role, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And something about that unsettled him more than he expected, because it introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was inefficient. And he did not build his world on inefficiency. "Third question," he said finally, his voice quieter, more controlled. "Do you think you are smarter than the people you serve?" And for the first time, there was a flicker of something in the air, not from her, but from the question itself, the weight of it, the way it revealed more about him than it did about her. And Clara looked at him for a moment, not long, just enough to register the intent behind the words. And then she reached for the glass of water, adjusted it slightly so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table, a small, precise movement that had nothing to do with the question and everything to do with control. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, steady, almost neutral. "Your steak will be ready in about 5 minutes," she said. And that was all. No answer, no engagement, just information. And in that moment, something subtle but undeniable shifted again, because the game he had designed, the structure he had imposed, had not been broken. It had been ignored. And being ignored, Ethan realized, was far more difficult to manage than being challenged, because there was nothing to win against, nothing to defeat, only himself. Reflected back in the space she refused to fill. For a brief moment, nothing moved. Not the air, not the quiet hum of conversations, not even the rhythm of Ethan's fingers against the table. And that stillness pressed in on him in a way he had not expected, because it was not resistance, it was absence, and absence gave him nothing to work with, nothing to dissect, nothing to control, and he realized, slowly, that the structure he had built, the 3 questions, the implied reward, the careful escalation, had all dissolved without a single direct challenge, as if the entire framework had never existed to begin with. And that realization unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it meant the rules he relied on were not universal, not here, not with her, and he shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture, straightening his jacket, a subtle reset that usually brought the situation back into alignment. But this time, it did not land the same way, because she had already stepped outside the alignment entirely. And when Clara turned to leave, her steps measured and quiet, Ethan spoke again, not louder, but faster, the control slipping just enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. "Wait," he said, and the word carried more weight than he intended. Enough to make her pause, just for a second, before turning back, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, and he studied her again, more carefully now, not as a role, not as a category, but as something he had not yet understood, and that unfamiliarity pushed him into a different approach, one he rarely needed. "You are avoiding the questions," he said, his tone controlled but tighter, less fluid. And Clara held his gaze for a moment, not long, just enough to acknowledge the statement, and then she gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, not an apology, just recognition. "I am doing my job," she replied, her voice calm, even, and the simplicity of it landed with unexpected weight, because it reframed everything, stripped away the layers he had tried to impose, reduced the entire interaction to something far more basic, and in that simplicity, his questions lost their importance, their relevance, their leverage, and Ethan leaned back again, slower this time, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the shift, because he could feel it now, clearly, the loss of control, not dramatic, not obvious, but real, and he did not like losing control, not in business, not in conversation, not anywhere, and he tried once more, his voice softening, shifting into something almost reasonable, almost persuasive. "You know," he said, his tone measured, "most people would take the opportunity." And it was not an accusation, not exactly, but it carried expectation, a subtle pressure. To conform, to align with what he considered normal, predictable behavior. And Clara listened, her posture unchanged, her hands still, and for a moment, it seemed like she might respond, like she might step into the space he had opened, but instead, she simply adjusted the edge of the table's setting again, aligning the fork with precise care, a small, deliberate action that had nothing to do with his words and everything to do with her control over herself. And when she spoke, her voice remained soft, steady, untouched by the tension that had begun to build around them. "Most people are not me," she said, and the sentence was simple, almost quiet, but it carried a weight that lingered in the air, long after the words were gone, because it did not challenge him directly, it did not argue, it did not explain, it simply existed as a statement of fact. And in that moment, Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time, not just in the interaction, but in his understanding of it, because for the first time, he was not sure what move to make next, not sure how to reframe, not sure how to regain the position he had assumed was his from the start. And as Clara turned and walked toward the kitchen, her steps steady, unhurried, Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, his mind unusually quiet, not because there was nothing to think, but because for once, he did not have an answer ready, and the silence she left behind did not feel empty anymore. It felt deliberate, like a space he had been placed into rather than one he had created himself. The kitchen doors swung open with a soft push, releasing a brief wave of heat and the muted clatter of plates, and Clara stepped through it without looking back, her pace unchanged, her expression untouched by whatever had just unfolded at table 12, while behind her, Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed on the empty space she had left behind as if the answer he was looking for might still be there. lingering somewhere between the glass of water and the neatly aligned silverware. And for the first time that evening, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, did not fill the silence with movement. Because something about that silence felt different now, not passive, not background, but intentional, like it had been placed there with purpose. And he exhaled slowly, leaning back into his chair, his fingers resting still against the table as he replayed the interaction in his mind. Not the words, but the gaps between them, the moments where she had chosen not to respond, not to engage, not to give him anything to work with. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how unfamiliar that felt, because in his world, everything had leverage, every conversation had an angle, every person had a point where they revealed themselves if you applied the right pressure, but she had not revealed anything. Not because she resisted, but because she never stepped into the structure at all, and that distinction unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. And when the kitchen doors opened again, Clara returned with his plate, the ribeye set perfectly at the center, the presentation precise, deliberate, as if nothing else mattered beyond the execution of the task. And she placed it in front of him with the same quiet efficiency as before, the faint aroma of seared steak rising between them, grounding the moment in something tangible, something real. And Ethan looked at the plate, then back at her, his expression harder to read now, less certain, more measured. "You are very consistent," he said, echoing her earlier word. But this time it carried a different weight, less critique, more observation, and Clara gave a small nod, not taking the bait, not expanding the conversation, just acknowledging the statement as it was. And he picked up his knife and fork, cutting into the steak with precise movements, more out of habit than hunger, his attention still fixed on her in a way he could not quite explain. And after a moment, he set the utensils down again, untouched food resting on the plate as he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, not sharp, not challenging, but searching. "Do you always do this?" he asked, and for the first time, there was no clear structure to the question, no defined outcome, just curiosity, raw and unfiltered. And Clara looked at him, really. Looked this time, not long, but long enough to register the shift, the absence of performance in his tone, and she paused, not to build tension, not to calculate, but because the question was different. And when she spoke, her voice remained soft, steady, but there was a subtle change, something quieter beneath it. "Do what?" she asked, and the simplicity of it caught him off guard, because he realized, in that moment, that he did not have a clean answer, did not have a defined label for what had just happened, and he hesitated, just slightly, before responding. "Step back," he said, the words slower now, less certain, "and let people show you who they are." And Clara held his gaze for a second longer, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes suggested she understood exactly what he meant. And then she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "It saves time," she replied, and the words settled between them, quiet, unforced. And for the first time since he sat down, Ethan did not try to respond immediately, did not try to reframe or redirect. He simply sat there, absorbing it, the weight of something he had not considered before. And as Clara turned to leave again, moving back into the rhythm of the restaurant, Ethan remained where he was, his untouched steak cooling slowly in front of him, his mind no longer racing ahead, but catching up to a realization that had been building all along, that the game he thought he was playing had never actually begun, and that somehow, without raising her voice, without answering his questions, without engaging on his terms, she had already moved beyond it entirely. The steak sat untouched for another moment, the heat fading slowly, a thin line of steam disappearing into the quiet air as Ethan finally reached for his fork again, not out of appetite, but out of habit, the kind of motion that usually anchored him, gave him something to control, something predictable, and yet even that felt slightly off now, like the rhythm had shifted in a way he could not fully recalibrate. And across the room, Clara moved between tables with the same measured pace, the same quiet efficiency, greeting guests, refilling glasses, adjusting small details most people would never notice. And no one watching her would have guessed that anything unusual had happened. No one would have seen the subtle disruption she had left behind at table 12, because she did not carry it with her. She did not linger in it. She simply moved on. And that, more than anything, unsettled Ethan, because in his world, Interactions left marks. They created outcomes. They defined positions. But here, it was as if the moment had dissolved the second she stepped away, leaving him alone with something he could not quite categorize. And he cut into the steak again, this time taking a bite, chewing slowly, his attention drifting not to the taste, not to the room, but to the pattern he had been so certain of before, the one that now felt incomplete. And he realized, gradually, that he had not been testing her. Not really. He had been testing a version of her that existed only in his assumptions. And when she did not match that version, the entire test had lost its meaning. And that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, not sharp, not sudden, but persistent. And when Clara returned to his table to check on him, her presence calm, unhurried, Ethan looked up immediately, as if he had been waiting without admitting it. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone professional, neutral, the same as it had been from the beginning. And for a moment, he almost responded with something automatic, something expected, but the words did not come as easily as they usually did, and instead, he paused, just long enough to feel the difference. "Yes," he said finally, but even to his own ears, it sounded less like an answer and more like a placeholder, and Clara gave a small nod, accepting it without question, without probing, and that absence of pressure made the silence between them stretch again. But this time, it did not feel like something to escape, it felt like something to sit with. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady now, not searching for leverage, not calculating an angle, just observing. "You knew," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before, and Clara tilted her head just slightly, not confused, not defensive, just acknowledging the statement. "Knew what?" she asked, and he exhaled softly, a faint shift in his posture as if something inside him had loosened. "That I was not really asking questions," he said. The words slower now, more deliberate, and Clara held his gaze for a second, then gave the smallest nod, the kind that did not seek recognition or validation, just agreement. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the understanding settling between them without needing to be explained, and Ethan looked down at his plate again, then back at her, something quieter in his expression now, something that did not need to prove anything. "Most people would have answered," he said, not as a challenge this time, but as a realization, and Clara's response came just as simply as before. "Most people think they have to," she said, and the words landed with a clarity that felt almost disarming, because they stripped away the complexity he had built around the interaction, reduced it to something far more fundamental, and Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting, not reframing, just letting it settle. And as Clara turned to leave once more, stepping back into the flow of the restaurant, Ethan remained where he was, his posture more relaxed than before, his thoughts no longer racing ahead, but moving at a pace that matched the quiet rhythm around him. And for the first time that evening, he was not trying to control the moment. He was simply in it, and the silence that had once felt like a challenge now felt like something else entirely, something closer to clarity. The restaurant had settled into a quieter rhythm now, the earlier tension dissolving into soft conversations and the occasional clink of glass against polished wood. And at table 12, Ethan no longer looked like a man running a test. He looked like someone observing something he had not planned for. His posture no longer rigid with control, but eased just enough to suggest a shift that even he had not fully processed. And as he reached for his glass of water, his movements slower, more deliberate, he found himself watching Clara again. Not with the sharp focus of evaluation, but with something closer to curiosity, the kind that did not demand answers but allowed space for them to exist. And across the room, she continued as she always had, moving between tables, adjusting details, speaking softly when needed, silent when not. Her presence consistent in a way that now felt less like routine and more like intention, and that distinction stayed with him, quietly reshaping the way he interpreted everything that had happened. And when she returned once more to his table, not because he had called her, but because it was simply time to check in, the moment felt different, not charged, not tense, but grounded, and Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze without the usual layer of calculation. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and the phrasing itself carried a subtle change, not a demand, not a setup, but a request. And Clara paused, not because she needed to think, but because she recognized the difference, the absence of pressure behind the words, and she gave a small nod, a simple acknowledgement that the space was open, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Why did you not answer any of my questions?" he asked, and this time, the question did not feel like a trap. It felt like something genuine, something he did not already have an answer for. And Clara considered him for a moment, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice remained soft, but there was a clarity in it that did not need emphasis. "Because they were not really about me," she said, and the words landed without force, but with precision, cutting through the layers he had built around the interaction and revealing something simpler underneath. And Ethan held her gaze, the realization settling in slowly, not as a shock, but as a recognition, something he could not deny because he could see it now, clearly, in the way the conversation had unfolded, in the way every question had been framed, in the way he had expected her to respond. And he exhaled softly, a faint shift in his posture, as if he were letting go of something he had not realized he was holding. "So you just let me talk," he said, not as a criticism, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and Clara gave a small nod, her response simple, unembellished. "People usually do," she replied, and for a moment, the silence returned, but it no longer carried tension, it carried understanding, a shared recognition of what had actually happened, and Ethan looked down at his plate again, then back at her, something quieter in his expression now, something that did not need to assert itself. "And that tells you enough," he said, more to himself than to her, and Clara's answer came just as softly. "It usually does," and the exchange ended there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because nothing more was needed, and as she turned to leave again, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, Ethan remained where he was, not reaching for another question, not trying to extend the moment, just sitting with the clarity that had settled in its place. And for the first time that evening, he understood that the silence he had tried to break was never empty. It had been speaking the entire time, just not in a language he was used to hearing. The check arrived without announcement, placed gently at the edge of the table with the same quiet precision Clara had carried through every moment of the evening, and Ethan glanced down at it almost absently, his attention not fully on the numbers or the itemized list, but on the weight of everything that had led to this point. The conversation that never quite became a conversation, the questions that never found answers, and yet somehow revealed more than he had intended, and he opened the folder slowly, not with the usual efficiency of someone accustomed to transactions, but with a measured pause, as if the act itself had taken on a different meaning. And inside, the receipt was exactly what it should have been, nothing hidden, nothing altered, just a simple record of a meal. And yet something about it felt different, not because of what was written, but because of what was not, and he reached into his jacket, pulling out his card, holding it between his fingers for a second, longer than necessary, his gaze drifting briefly across the room, finding Clara again as she stood near another table, listening, not speaking, her presence as steady as it had been from the start. And for a moment, he considered calling her back, saying something more, asking something different, but the impulse faded as quickly as it came, because he understood now, or at least he understood enough to know that anything he said would be for himself, not for her, and she did not need it, had never needed it. And he placed the card inside the folder, closing it with a quiet motion, the soft sound barely noticeable against the background of the room. And when Clara returned to collect it, her steps light, her expression unchanged, Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze one last time, not searching, not testing, just present. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, ordinary, but there was no edge to them, no hidden intention, just acknowledgement, and Clara gave a small nod, accepting it as she had accepted everything else, without attaching anything more to it than what it was. And she took the folder, her fingers steady, her movements unhurried, and as she turned to walk away, Ethan noticed something he had not seen before, not in her, but in the way the moment settled, the absence of any need to conclude it with something bigger, something definitive, because the conclusion had already happened, quietly, somewhere between the first question and the last silence. And he sat there for another moment, his hands resting against the table, his posture relaxed in a way that felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable, and around him. The restaurant continued as it always did, conversations rising and falling, glasses refilled, plates cleared. Nothing outwardly changed, and yet, for him, something had shifted in a way that did not require explanation, did not need to be announced, and when he finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a subtle motion, he did not look around to see who might be watching, did not check his phone, did not reassert the presence he had carried in with him. He simply walked toward the exit, his steps steady, his mind quieter than it had been all evening, and behind him, Clara placed the receipt into the register, her actions precise, consistent, no different than any other transaction. And yet, when she opened the folder, there was a brief pause, not because of the amount, not because of the tip, but because of a small detail left behind, something that did not belong to the standard process, something that did not need to be explained to anyone else. And she closed the folder again without reaction, setting it aside as she moved on to the next table, her rhythm unchanged, her presence steady. While outside, Ethan stepped into the night air, the cool temperature settling against him, grounding, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to move faster, to think ahead, to control what came next, because something about that quiet exchange, that absence of resistance, had already done what no direct challenge ever had. It had shown him something he could not unsee, not through argument, not through force, but through the simple act of letting him arrive at it on his own. The night air outside had a way of slowing things down, the distant hum of traffic blending with the soft echo of footsteps on the sidewalk, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting briefly against the cool metal of the door before letting it fall to his side, not because he had somewhere urgent to be, but because for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to rush toward anything at all. And inside, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that anything significant had taken place, unaware that a moment had shifted something that would not easily return to what it had been before. And behind the counter, Clara moved through her tasks with the same steady focus, closing out checks, aligning receipts, her hands precise, her pace unhurried, until her fingers paused just slightly on the folder Ethan had left behind, not from surprise, not from curiosity, but from recognition, and she opened it once more, her gaze dropping to proving anything, had not been waiting for an outcome. She had simply held her ground in the quietest way possible, and that had been enough. And outside, Ethan began to walk, his steps steady against the pavement, the city lights reflecting faintly against the glass windows he passed, and as he moved, his thoughts did not race ahead the way they usually did not map out the next conversation, the next negotiation, the next advantage. They lingered instead on something far simpler, the realization that control was not always about directing the moment, that sometimes it was about knowing when not to engage at all, and that understanding settled into him with a quiet clarity, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but lasting. And he glanced briefly at his reflection in a darkened storefront window, not to check his appearance, not to measure his presence, but to observe, to see something he had not noticed before, the absence of urgency, the absence of performance, and he continued walking, the sound